This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan intellectual tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
I'd like to talk about entering divine life. And in parentheses, we could put AKA, also known as salvation. Because I think the Franciscan tradition is about life. It's about giving life and increasing life. And although salvation can be a component of that, I wouldn't say it's our dominant language. And at least the common understanding of salvation is not our dominant image. And I've put here the icon of the Holy Cross. It could be called the icon of the lifting up of the Lord in glory from the Church of San Damiano, now at the Monastery of St. Clare in Assisi. This, I think, is a good icon for the Franciscan tradition when we talk about entering into divine life. I'm sure many of you have heard talks, have given talks, have written things about the icon of San Damiano. It is formative in his early years, I think, for Francis, and at least that he would have seen it. He probably would have prayed in front of it. Even more so for Clare, however, who spent 40 years in front of this image. It is clearly an image of a living Christ. Eyes wide open. And the work that's being done on the interpretation of this as an icon, I think, helps us to understand perhaps some of the roots of our own tradition. Thomas of Celano tells us, in the same chapter, chapter 30 of his Life of Francis, when he tells us how Francis was filled with this awareness of the humility of the Incarnation that he wanted to enact at Greccio, Thomas tells us that Francis was also filled, overwhelmed really, with the charity of the Passion. I think a very interesting and appropriate vocabulary. For Francis, as for Clare, and for later members of the Franciscan tradition, the life and death of Christ is about charity. It's about love. That is the mystery that is contained here. The cross is the mystery of self-giving love. It is about sharing love and life with those who are around the figure of Jesus, even pictorially represented on that cross. There is a body of disciples gathered around on the left and right hand sides of the cross. The suffering and death of Jesus is the highest expression of living sine proprio. And thanks to Seamus for pointing this out to me. The mystery of the poverty of God is actually revealed in the cross. That what we see there is the last thing which Jesus has, which is breath, which is spirit, even that he does not claim as his own, but breathes it forth. Even at the end, Jesus is not clinging to life itself. The cross is part of this mystery of self-giving love, even to the point of giving life for others. St. Clare, as I said, probably spent 40 years of her life praying before that image of the San Damiano crucifix. She has been formed by it, I think, in a way that Francis was not. He was formed by other images. Clare is deeply shaped in her understanding of the cross by this image. And she writes to Agnes of Prague about this mirror. Look at this mirror, she says, with the mirror hanging on the wood of the cross. On the original, which I think many of you have probably seen, the face and the halo or the nimbus around the face of Christ is actually lifted slightly from the surface of the cross. It's actually leaning forward. The whole cross itself would have been suspended in the sanctuary of San Damiano, leaning forward with a lamp, an oil lamp burning in front of it, as you would before any icon. The area around the face of Christ is painted with gold leaf, so it's shiny. When Clare talks about a mirror hanging on the wood of the cross, I think that she's thinking quite specifically of that face, the face of Christ on the San Damiano crucifix. I think it's at least a reasonable hypothesis. If we look at that face, the eyes are wide open. The look on the face of Christ is not one of anguish, but is rather one of interest, even of compassion. That circle that you see around the face, and this is thanks to my colleague Michael Guinan, actually reflects beautifully the theology of glory in John's Gospel. This is actually an icon taken from the account of the Passion from the Gospel of St. John, painted in the Syro-Byzantine tradition. That circle of, like a halo around the head, if you look, actually extends under the chin and onto the neck of the figure. It's as if the whole face of Jesus there is covered with a bit of a shadow. It's actually a little darker than the rest of the body, which is full of light. The reason is that that face is covered with glory. And glory, for I think our Old Testament scholars here could tell us that glory is not the brilliant light that you do see. It's rather the cloud or the covering that descends when God is present. So that, you might say, that shadowy image over the face of Jesus is the glory of God being revealed. This is the glorification of the Lord, being lifted up into glory. The meaning of the cross in John's Gospel. Because on the top of the cross, as we continue, we'll see that that action will continue. At the side of the cross, there are people gathered there, and I'm just showing the figures here on the right-hand side, near the wound in the side of Christ. The figures there, of course, are St. John and Mary, the mother of Jesus, along with the tiny figure of Longinus, the soldier with the lance who has opened the side of Jesus on the cross. And it's actually the place where the blood of Jesus is dripping. It's dripping onto John and onto Mary. That's where the life is going. It's going into the people who are closest to the Lord. This is about a risen Lord sharing life from his side. It's also a beautiful image of the Eucharist. The entry into divine life is through the incarnation, through the life, through the dying, through the rising of Christ. All of this is the way in, because the way in is through a person and not through an act. It is not as if the suffering and death of Christ, removed from everything else, is the way into salvation. It is the person who is the way into salvation. We have actually a lovely remark remembered by the companions, something that Francis said, that one of the reasons to celebrate Christmas was because from the very day of the incarnation, our salvation was assured. It is not just death that brings life, it's incarnation and life and death and rising that brings life. Life-giving love is the focus rather than paying of a debt through suffering. I would say that this part of the Franciscan tradition is probably one of the parts that is best represented in our pastoral practice, in our teaching, in our preaching. That notion that the cross is a mystery of love and not a mystery of justice, I think is one of the hallmarks of our own Franciscan devotions to the cross. It is about life rather than being about suffering. We can easily think of what an opposite view of this would be. I mentioned earlier television preachers. Whether these be Catholic or Protestant, whether it's the AM radio going through the Central Valley of California or watching some television programs, that the emphasis, the interpretation of the cross as a punishment demanded by a vindictive father, which an obliging son does in order to calm the wrath of an abusive parent, is at the heart of a lot of that theology. I mean, it's sad when we hear it to think that this is how we represent the mystery of Christ, where it is not about love, but it is about paying a debt to a dishonored father. It's a very sad caricature, I think, of the fullness of the gospel message. What we see in the Franciscan tradition, again, something that was borrowed and enhanced from the tradition of Eastern Christianity, is the cross as the tree of life. Christ has suffered and died once and for all. The Christ who is present is always a risen Christ with those eyes wide open, and the blood that is being poured forth is the blood of birth, not the blood of death. The implications of this tradition are, in part, pretty easy to see. That the death of Jesus is the ultimate gift. We see here in the top image what the rest of the story is about. That life, which has been freely given as a gift by Jesus, who holds on to nothing, is freely given back to him by the God who has sent him, the communion of the divine Trinity. Jesus precedes us as the first who is going back to our destiny in the life of the Trinity. As he rises and ascends, he's greeted by the blessing hand of the Father, reaching down in that little semicircle. When we look at Jesus, particularly in this figure of the cross of San Damiano, Jesus is the revelation of the compassion of the Trinity. The suffering that is there is suffering in solidarity with our suffering. It is not in order to make us feel guilty. It is not to punish us further. It is God's participation in human suffering, which Jesus does not reject. That is, the commitment of the incarnation remains even when that implies great personal sacrifice. God's commitment to incarnation, to creaturehood, does not change as a result of that. It's about suffering with, not paying back. And, to use Franciscan language, sister death is the way through which we pass over into new life. We certainly see this in Francis's addition of that strophe to the canticle about sister death. And it's also represented here that death is the way into this newness of life. And Christ is leading the procession. This is not to minimize human death. It's not to minimize human suffering. I think to the contrary. It is to show that one of the things that we hold in common with God because of Christ is the experience of suffering and death. Just as one of the things we can be sure we have in common with divine experience is the experience of the body. Because of the incarnation, God knows suffering. God knows death in Christ. That human experience is not foreign. This is the compassion of God. One of Bonaventure's preferred terms in his vocabulary, those words that have "come" at the beginning, compassion, to suffer with, to experience with. The cross, like the incarnation, is God's participation in the experience of humanity.